New Zealand's Foreign Minister Winston Peters has begun a 3-day trip to China, and the visit comes at a time of growing tensions between Wellington and Beijing over China's naval exercises in the Tasman Sea, and also a deal it struck with the Pacific nation Cook Islands. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Dziedzic joins me now from Parliament House in Canberra. Stephen, what are we expecting Winston Peters to say to his Chinese counterpart?
Well, Gemma, I think those two topics will be very high on the agenda for Mr. Peters. Of course, the Chinese naval task group that we've seen moving through the Tasman Sea, now heading towards Tasmania, has been a real point of tension between Australia and New Zealand on one hand and China on the other. Both Winston Peters, the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, as well as senior officials in Australia, have made it clear that they do not believe that the Chinese Navy gave sufficient notice to them before commencing live-fire exercises on Friday and Saturday last week. And we've heard from the Australian government that they believe that this conduct was disruptive. Now, this doesn't mean that the Chinese Naval Task Group is breaking international law, but Winston Peters is nonetheless very likely to press the Chinese government on this matter when he arrives in Beijing, saying that he believes China should show more notice and also should be more transparent more broadly about exactly what it's trying to achieve with this naval task group. Now, the other thing, as you mentioned, is likely to be this deal between China and the Cook Islands. Cook Islands has a somewhat unique relationship with New Zealand. It's got basically a status of free association, which gives it benefits in return for giving a level of sovereignty to New Zealand. New Zealand's been frustrated that Cook Islands signed this deal with China, despite the fact that Wellington had deep concerns. It's particularly worried about an agreement that Cook Islands has struck with China on deep sea mining. It believes that there aren't just commercial, but also potential strategic implications to that agreement. So I think it's very likely that Winston Peters will make New Zealand's unease clear when he meets with Wang Yi later in the week.
Meanwhile, Stephen, what is the latest on the movements of these Chinese warships?
The latest information from defence officials who are right now in front of a Senate Estimates Committee is that it's moving effectively southwest. It's no longer directly in the middle of the Tasman Sea. It's tracking closer to Tasmania. According to the head of the the Chief of the Defence Force this morning, it's around 250 kilometres south of Hobart at the moment. Now, the Australian government has been increasingly clear that it does see strategic implications and ramifications from this task group and what it's doing. And in particular, the question that's most recently cropped up in estimates hearings this morning is exactly what is the full strength of this task group. We know about the frigate, the cruiser and the supply ship or the fuelling ship that's going with them. But the ABC's been told by defence officials that the working assumption from many in the Defence Department is that it would likely also be accompanied by a submarine, potentially a nuclear-powered submarine. Now, the Chief of the Defence Force and others were asked this morning whether that was the case, whether Australia could know or could be certain that there was a submarine trailing this task group or taking part with this task group. Let's take a listen to the response from the Chief of the Defence Force.
I don't know whether there is a submarine with them. It is possible. Task groups occasionally do deploy with submarines, but not always. I can't be definitive on whether that's the case.
Stephen, what does the government believe China is trying to achieve with this?
Well, senior ministers, including the Prime Minister, haven't wanted to speculate publicly about this and have been pretty careful in their public language. But we got a more blunt and unvarnished account from Andrew Shearer, a top intelligence boss within the Australian defence community on Monday night during Senate estimates. He said that China was showing its ability to project power into our region. He said that this task group and its behaviour was unprecedented because it's the furthest south that the PLAN has operated in this part of the world. And he said that the intent was clear: one, to demonstrate its power; two, to shape the response of countries like Australia to global events; and three, to monitor our response to the task group to draw conclusions about what we might do in the future. What he seemed to be suggesting is that China wants to shape Australia's behaviour, perhaps dissuade Australia from doing things like taking part in freedom of navigation exercises in places like the South China Sea, where we've seen a number of encounters between the Australian and Chinese military over recent years. One thing is clear though, Gemma, China's power is swelling, its naval might is growing, and increasingly that's going to have serious ramifications for Australia and for Australia's strategic policy.